you to today's speakers. Joining us today is Ted Latofsky, an enterprise architect at Evolving Solutions. In this role, he helps architect and deliver multi-siloed hybrid cloud solutions. Ted brings a deep background in data services, storage, backup, and resilient infrastructure. He complements that with experience as a customer, vendor, and business partner, which provides him with a realistic and holistic understanding of what approaches work and what success looks like as you modernize. Please welcome Ted. Next, we have Michael Downs, Chief Technology Officer at Evolving Solutions. For more than 20 years, Michael has created architecture to solve complex business problems. As Chief Technology Officer, Michael leads a team of experts focused on helping our clients solve their most challenging business and technical problems. He is constantly evaluating emerging technologies and sharing that information with Evolving Solutions technical team so they can better help our clients address their business challenges. Michael, now I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kelly, so much. I appreciate that. And welcome, Ted.
Good morning.
Glad you could join us today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So before we dive into the main topic of data protection, I wanted to provide everybody with a little bit of additional background on Evolving Solutions. Many of you are familiar with who we are and what we do, but I thought it would be helpful to provide that background to everyone. So Evolving Solutions is a technology solution provider who's focused on automating and modernizing your business critical applications. Really, we talk about this as modern operations, really bringing together the capabilities that you've always delivered to your clients, to your business clients as a technology solution provider inside of your organization. The capabilities you've built up over the last decades in terms of availability, reliability, scalability, security, cost control, all of those things are critical. And being able to deliver those things in a new world where cloud is a critical piece of it is really what we're here to help our clients be successful with. And obviously data protection is a big piece of that. And as we'll discuss later, there's a lot of changes there. So the other, just would also provide some additional background. One of the things we're seeing with a lot of our clients is there's just some huge changes going on in the world right now. And not only is there a lot of change, and feel like we've been saying this for 20 or 15 or 20 years, all the changes that are going on in the world. Nothing could make that more apparent than the last 2 years, and honestly, the last 48 hours is yet another example of how rapidly things are changing in the world. Some higher level of predictability maybe in the last 48 hours, but certainly in the last 2 years, many things that no one could have predicted would happen, or at the very least, we couldn't properly prepare for in ways that we couldn't expect. And so in order for our businesses to be able to continue to survive and thrive and take advantage of opportunities, we have to be able to think about architecture, think about a technology footprint, think about a business structure that allows for a high level of flexibility and adaptability in order to be able to continue to survive and thrive. And one of the core principles behind that then is developing what we think of as digital transformation. Digital transformation become a bit of a buzzword, but I think it's profoundly a good description of what is going on inside of our businesses and inside of our own organizations. Technologies become more and more of a key piece of what we do in the business world, and that's because more and more processes are becoming digital. The ability to have clients order online and pick up in a store, the ability to interact with your partners and your clients and your high value employees in a digital way, the ability to work from anywhere on any device, all of these things really are the underpinnings of that flexibility that we allow the business to have through technology. And there are some key things that are sort of the pillars that help the business that the business needs to address in order to be able to deal with that uncertainty. Certainly things like avoiding lock-in and increased flexibility is a tremendous piece of this. There are a tremendous amount of new good options available from technology solution providers, new cloud offerings and so on. But the ability to avoid lock-in, to be able to have the flexibility that you need to be able to deliver that value for your clients and actually to deliver your ongoing business on top of your technology can't be compromised by getting ourselves locked into individual silos. Enabling a cloud-like experience is a critical piece of this. We talk about cloud as not as a place, but as a set of disciplines. And the reason that that's so important is that that underlying capability, that underlying discipline is what allows the flexibility to happen. So all of those things that we think about as cloudy are the things that allow us to provide the flexibility that I've talked about earlier for our businesses. And finally, data resiliency is a critical piece of this. So whether that's through backup or recovery or high availability, really the meat of what we're going to talk about today, that's a core piece of being able to make sure that our businesses survive and thrive in this new world. As I mentioned, we really think of cloud as not a place, it's a set of disciplines. It's a way of going about providing IT operations to the organizations that we support and work with. I can actually credit Ted with having coined this as we were talking through internally what some of the things were that the ways that we were seeing clients interact in new ways with their business. And certainly there are lots of public cloud options out there, and we're going to talk quite a bit today about how public cloud intersects with sort of traditional infrastructure. But even outside of a public cloud environment, cloud really is the way that we go about delivering services, delivering capabilities, delivering the business, both to our organizations and to their clients and to the partners that they work with. So enough about evolving solutions. Let's get to the reason that we're all here today. So Ted and I have, Ted has spent a lot of time, Ted, Kelly provided a little bit of background on for Ted when we started off, but Ted really has done a tremendous amount of work with not just what we traditionally think of as storage or backup, but really how does data and the availability of data impact our clients? And more importantly, business in general. What are the things that are foundational principles, the things that we need to think about as we start being able to support this new technology first or technology enabled business for our clients. So I want to just start off by starting with what I think of as one of the key foundational principles that you and I have talked about a number of times, which is that when you think about data recovery or you think about data availability and resilience, that the workflow is sort of king.
Absolutely. One of the things that we've noticed in an increasingly automated and an increasingly cloudy environment is that old school methodologies where we think about how we restore a server or how we restore a storage LUN or how we restore a file system, uh, those things are still useful, but they're incomplete. They don't necessarily solve the new problem, which is how do we restore the business function? How do we get back to all the processes that we think of as a workflow inside any given business to our customers?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think this extends everything from, core services like DNS and DHCP and some of the network identity, all the things that we think about in terms of core services that have to be considered under disaster recovery. But it also is how are systems interrelated? How are things talking to each other? It extends well beyond the data.
Absolutely. It's not just data and data services. It becomes this holistic view of what the dependencies are, what the interdependencies are. Do I need a given set of services to be functioning all the time at any given tier in order for the next set of business services and business functions to happen? And is there a reciprocal nature in which I might need a kind of service to function in order to get to another service, and I need the feedback on that, where particularly in an increasingly cloud environment, I'll need to know how to dynamically scale both up and down as I want my workflow to meet demand.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that sort of actually brings me to our next topic of discussion a little bit. You mentioned cloud already. Um, I've seen a lot of clients, probably at least half of our clients, have discussions with us in some way or another about doing disaster recovery to the cloud or uh, adopting cloud in general, and what workflows go best in cloud. And one of the key points that we've talked about repeatedly too is that those two things are really interrelated. And I think you've got a unique perspective on this.
I hope so. I think that one of the first thoughts that we probably want to make sure that we share is that uh, many customers, uh, we see a trend in the industry that data protection is now looking at cloud, looking at object, looking at S3, looking at blob as a repository. So not only do I still have my more traditional ways of backing up, but now I'm using public cloud as a place to store my data.
Yeah,
And one of the important things that happens with that is that that becomes a kind of unexpected on-ramp. When customers want to talk about moving workload into the cloud, um, they almost always discover issues of what we call data locality, which is where my original source data lives, and data gravity, which is often if that data set is very large, it's hard to move in a timely fashion.
sure.
So data protection using public cloud, we discover that uh, that we're solving the problem because we have a copy of the data that we're talking about already moved up into the cloud. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is immediately usable in that fashion, but we've solved one of the difficult issues right there
Mm.
by having data already physically resident in the public cloud.
Yeah,
The
and one of the
second,
things,
go
no, go
ahead.
ahead.
I would say the second part of that is that, as I already said, if I'm just using public cloud as a repository, then I probably want to significantly rethink how I architect data protection in the first place. What
Absolutely.
is it that I'm thinking about in terms of how do backups and restorals go to or come from the cloud? And as I look at increasingly hybrid cloud workloads or cloud native workloads, how do I protect the data that's in the cloud
Mhm.
itself? So those questions have to be asked early on because it becomes difficult at best to just bolt those features or functions on. I would say that you really want to design for them as you begin to make those decisions in the first place.
Yeah, I want to take just a step back for the folks who are joining us today too, and just talk a little bit about data protection in general. We've talked about backup and recovery, really, especially as we move into this cloud environments. It's got two other axes too, around resilience and around availability. And so it's not, when we talk about data protection, we're not just talking necessarily about, I'm going to back it up, I'm going to recover it in the event of a disaster. It really is about things like how do we how do we make choices around availability and resilience, because that's what we're after when we think about how does the business stay available. So as we start talking about cloud native workloads, Ted just touched on, thinking about the architecture differently. You may or may not have a true backup in the sense that we always think of backup in DR if you have a cloud native environment. You may be doing replication across multiple clouds or another approach completely to be able to deal with that. And I know that's something we've seen with clients. Good example of that, we had a client who had built an application in one of the public clouds that provided what became a core business service for them. And they realized that they needed to back it up because that was part of their governance strategy. Their board said this is business critical. It's got to match the rest of our standards. As they started looking at ways of doing it, there was only one that was cost effective, which was using the cloud native capabilities that were there. And because they had already designed an architecture without taking into consideration the fact that that workload might become business critical and it might need to be able to back up and recover in more than just the one that their backup and architecture choices, backup and recovery choices might not be uh, best suited to just cloud, but now they're stuck. That's sort of where they are.
Indeed.
So, um, I'm going to move us on a little bit to the next topic, a little bit around sort of some of the challenges of public cloud and the value to having data there in the first place.
So I think that when we talk about how we move data, which again is only part of the discussion, right? So when we're talking about moving to cloud, we're also talking workload. But when we want to talk about how to move data to the public cloud, I don't see that as a challenge in and of itself, right? Most public cloud vendors do not charge for data ingress significantly. They'll charge for storing of the data. They'll charge for motion of data or retrieval, egress of data. So the issue isn't just how I get it into the cloud, other than obvious questions about bandwidth and connectivity, more about how that data is or isn't ready to be used in a given workload. Again, if I'm just moving data into the cloud for data protection, then I may have to do something. I may have to restore that data or convert it in order to be able to use it in a workload. And vice versa, if I am doing cloud native workloads,
Hmm.
then the data that lives in that cloud, whether it's public or hybrid or even a private cloud, may not necessarily be in a format that we think of as a protected format, as a online or nearline or immutable version. So we have to strongly think about um, how it is that we protect the data and how it is that those workloads will use the data. And as a byproduct of that, we have to strongly evaluate uh, how the workloads themselves need the data to be presented. When we think about systems of engagement, and systems of record, we have different performance characteristics, different time responsiveness requirements. And we know that public cloud can easily solve some of those problems and may still have challenges for some of those other kinds of requirements.
Sure. Well, I think this also points out something else you and I have talked about quite a bit. I think people think I'm going to move my data into the public cloud. I'm going to stick it in an S3 bucket or an object storage bucket, and I'm great. I've got my copy up there. Well, if I go to do disaster recovery, the way my application, even if I've moved my application successfully into the cloud for whatever reason, copied a virtual machine or done a conversion using one of the available products to be able to have it go from a VMware instance or use a VM native cloud environment, that data is sitting in S3. That's going to potentially cause me problems without some sort of process to be able to move it out of an S3 or an object storage into the kind of format that my application is expecting in order to be able to use it. So you've got to have a process in place to think about how do I go from an object store back to a block store or back to a network file system type arrangement so that the workload, the application can actually read and write back to that data and I can be functioning up in the cloud again. So it's more than just moving the cloud and being able to be available in the cloud, but also being able to recover in the cloud requires a whole different set of thought process as well,
Absolutely.
which actually kind of leads me to the next bit of our conversation, which is around automation and sort of the role of automation in data protection.
So when we talk about automation in the first place, let's be clear that we're sort of setting the table. Um, we think of automation protection. Uh, we see that those systems become a lot more complicated, and as we've already described, they become a lot more interdependent.
Mhm.
And that means that thinking of solving those problems of protecting or restoring data as a manual process is often not very scalable and not very timely. Um, we see as a trend that increasingly single file or very small set of file restorals are often now automated to the point where it's all self-service, where the requester actually has direct access to the ability to get those things back. And we recognize that both just the trend in the industry as a whole with dramatic increases in data, and the fact that many of those increases are directly related to cloud workloads,
Mhm.
um, demand a greater degree of efficiency. And the only way to get to that level of efficiency is by automation, is by scripting and making systems that can respond to those requirements very quickly and often with less or even no human intervention.
And I think it's absolutely something we're seeing more and more. And the more you think about, clusters of servers or a large distributed database, the more, and again, you think about a microservices architecture from an application development perspective, the number of nodes and capabilities required to interact and that you might need to choose to recover components of, and the connectivity that you have to recover with each of those can be daunting. And so there's no way that any of this can happen completely in a physical realm, or excuse me, in a manual realm. So being able to automate it is super important. I think the other thing that overlays this is as you move into a world where you're thinking about infrastructure as code, well, infrastructure as code, now code is the thing you've got to back up. I've got to back up, I've got to have a copy or a replica of my Git repository. If I'm expecting to be able to use my Git repository to be able to rebuild my environment, but my Git repository is what went offline, that's a problem. So we're into a different kind of world when we start thinking about data protection in the public cloud, because it's not just that data. Now all that stuff truly is code. Nobody's, you're not walking and putting a CD in the server in Amazon's data center. We all know that, but it does bring about a whole new set of disciplines in terms of the way you think about doing recovery in a public cloud or a hyperscaler environment.
Indeed.
And so I think that another critical piece of all of this is one of the things everyone thinks about when you start thinking about applications in code is bad applications in code or corrupt applications in code. And one of the key pieces of data protection that we've seen appear over the last several years repeatedly is this challenge of ransomware. And I said at the beginning that one of the benefits of a digital transformation, or one of the sort of the requirements of this unpredictable world that we're in, is being able to transform what you do as a business into technology, or to be able to do it as a technology assets, because technology is inherently flexible. It's easier to change code than it is to physically move servers, which is part of what sparked much of this discussion in the first place. But the other thing that, of course, happens is you have an increased level of potential vulnerability that can scale. Even the vulnerability can scale quickly. You have a different set of actors working against you in a way that you never did in a traditional castle and moat kind of approach to security. So maybe, Ted, if you could share some of the things that you think about as you're talking to people about ransomware protection as it relates to data protection.
So, one of the very first things is that you can turn your data protection platform into an ally for detection. Obviously, one of the most crucial considerations for things like ransomware or other bad actor, bad agent software is how quickly you can discover it. So, many of the data protection platforms that exist now are capable of alerting when they see a dramatic change in the data that they protect. If all of a sudden, as an example, I can't access the data because it's been encrypted, or there's a dramatic change in the structure or format of the files, many of these data protection platforms are capable of alerting. Please note that that alerting requires some thought at the beginning and some automation setup. Um, it's also useful to understand that from that perspective, ransomware is very similar to other kinds of concerns for data corruption. So while the worry is different, the data protection platforms have been looking at this kind of thing. This is a fairly mature set of tools that are
Mhm.
just being pointed in a new way. However, one of the new concerns that comes from ransomware is what behaviors do we do in order to figure out how to get back? How do we get back to a known good state? How can we validate that our protection at any point in time doesn't contain the thing we're worried about. One of those conversations that we have with customers regularly is the idea that instead of necessarily buying more infrastructure, more software,
Hmm.
that um, processes need to change. One of the ones that we talk about is proactive test restorals in which the sandbox believes that it's further ahead in time. We
Right.
want to do test restorals 30 days, 60 days, 90 days out because one of the concerns in malware in particular is that it's time bombed, that we might have had 30 days of malware sitting there simply waiting for the clock. So in order to test that, we have to convince the environment that it's further into the future than it is. And again, a platform that's automated to help with that process, because otherwise the idea of the amount of personal resources of time, labor spent to do that becomes daunting. In an automated environment, that might simply be a net new process, and I'll simply need a sandbox in order to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ransomware is one of several things that we have to take into consideration when we think about actually protecting data. There are challenges around encryption. There's challenges around other kinds of security and segmentation that are profoundly part of what helps us keep our data safe. And I mentioned encryption. There's yet another core service. We all encrypt our data at rest at this point. I think pretty much think everybody has data encrypted in transit as well. You've probably got data encrypted that's living in any kind of public cloud. You've done some well-architected review or whatever the process is that you follow for your public cloud provider to make sure that you're following security principles there. But if you don't have your key store backed up and able to recover, you're in a place where, potentially in a world of hurt. Or if your key store is unavailable, because as we've all seen in the last 6 to 8 weeks, public cloud providers become unavailable. And so part of how you choose to architect that solution, not just for your own disaster recovery or your own ability to recover and adapt, but also your ability to decrypt that data, your ability to make your workflows back up and running is foundational to all of this. So as Ted sort of pointed out at the beginning, really understanding the workflow, understanding how the applications interact with each other, and as importantly, understanding how a new capability that may not, a new application that may be using the data differently needs that data to be available. And so as you start thinking about disaster recovery, it's not just, we've said this, to keep sort of hammering on this, but it's so critical because it's changing so much. It's not just about the data and the run and being able to bring it back online. It is about the workflow. And that means when you bring a new workflow online that may be using the data differently, that I've thought about how I might need to change my data recovery in order to be able to address that. And not just data recovery, the application recovery, I think is a good example of that. So I've started talking a bit more about cloud here, and we've got one more topic we want to spend a few minutes talking about with everybody, which is really that there's some unique challenges as we get into what we'll call cloud native workloads. And part of what we're several different perspectives we want to take here, but really what we're getting at is the cloud provides a whole bunch of interesting capabilities that you would probably never go build yourself. I don't think anybody's going to go build Google Big Sheets in their data center at this point. You're just going to go into Google's cloud and use it. Um, Even functions as a service, AWS Lambda and some of the other capabilities that are out there. There are ways you can build them on premise, and certainly some larger companies are. But the speed at which that kind of innovation is happening in public cloud is usually going to exceed what a private company can do. And honestly, that's one of the values of adopting a cloud approach is that you can take advantage of these different individual capabilities that different companies are spending their hard research dollars defining. But it does present some new challenges. Ted, can you maybe dive a little bit more into some of the things that we've seen people struggle with and work through?
Absolutely. So unlike our own private data centers, what we now want to think of as private cloud, one of the challenges in protecting data and protecting workloads in public providers comes from these new offerings where we're talking about platform as a service or even software as a service or services as a whole, where now our ability to own or manage the underlying platform is either lessened or actually removed, right? We don't think anything of having the ability to directly control a VMware a host or a VMware machine on-prem. But when we're talking about things that we're doing in a public provider, we recognize that very often we have been abstracted from the underlying infrastructure. As a matter of fact, to some extent, that's one of the value propositions normally, is that we no longer have to concern ourselves with administration. The flip side of that is that now we find ourselves incapable of doing traditional data protection around those things. I can't install a SQL agent on my SQL Server service in the cloud. I'll have to use a different set of tools. I'll have to come up with an entirely different methodology if I want to protect that. Uh, if I'm concerned about the availability of those things, I have to ask questions much the same as I would on-prem. If it's important enough to protect, do I just increase the availability of the data? Do I increase the availability of the workload? Do I replicate those things? Do I think about merely disaster recovery or high availability? Or am I going to look at a much more holistic picture of all of those things? Uh, as Michael talked about earlier, uh, one of the customers that we talked to who had built a cloud native workload and did not realize that it was going to become essential to the business. So how do I meet regulatory requirements and business requirements? Do I egress that data on a regular basis in order to have a backup copy? Or does it end up making more sense, good or bad or indifferent, to replicate it to an entirely different region or zone? And often that becomes um, both a business architecture decision and a TCO dollars and cents kind of conversation.
Absolutely. Well, and I think one of the things that you and I have talked about a couple times is there's the egress cost, but if I'm using a DBMS or database as a service from my cloud provider, I'm not going to even be able to get it on premise or out of that cloud in a format that I can do anything with in most cases. That's proprietary oftentimes to the cloud provider. Back to one of the core principles of trying to avoid lock-in. And some of our we've seen some of the cloud providers give clients the option by creating things like Amazon Outposts or Google's Anthos or some of these other alternatives that allow you to essentially use their capabilities on premise. And certainly becomes an option once if you're concerned about the availability of the public cloud provider or your connectivity back to them for some reason. But there are still core services that are going to be dependent on being able to reach out to that cloud provider in order to be able to do things like authentication, and under certain circumstances, it's not going to be able to live on an island by itself. So to me, this is actually one of the most interesting uh, challenges right now in terms of data protection and enterprises is we want to take advantage of some of these really cool, valuable things that are available in the cloud, and we absolutely should take advantage of some of these things that are available in the public cloud. Take advantage of a lot of them. It's a core part of making our businesses flexible and agile. But protecting that in a way that takes us out of a public realm back into a space that we have a little bit more control of presents a whole new set of challenges. And we've seen, Ted, I know that you mentioned we've seen a couple of providers sort of start to try to tackle that challenge. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say that that's accurate. I would also say that as we look to both the immediate and longer term future, the cloud providers are recognizing the fact that in the same way that we have to be concerned about um, data protection, data availability, workload availability. There used to be a lot of conversations that have fallen silent recently about what we'll call Cloudburst, the ability to increase our business's ability to do work by um, adding to our capabilities with cloud, to supplement on-prem with public cloud and do true hybrid cloud. Those conversations became very quiet uh, when the realization that the behavior might not be the same on-prem and off-prem. Now I think we're just starting to see that the cloud providers and business partners are working with customers to think of new ways, whether it's things like Outpost or containerization or any one of a variety of technologies to make workload on-prem truly private cloud capable so that the ability to move gracefully, to burst up into public cloud, to come back down out of it, becomes less of an issue. And those are probably where the most interesting challenges are.
Mm. I absolutely agree. And this is, I really think this is the center of what both us and many of the organizations we work with are struggling with is these are really great capabilities that are available from these public providers and that are more and more becoming available on premise. They bring a whole new set of challenges in terms of how you architect. And architecture has always been important. Being able to plan ahead has always been important. It's just become so much more profoundly important as we start thinking about all the things we've been doing as IT operators for, you know, 2 dozen decades, right? Well, not quite that long, but for decades now, we've been doing these core capabilities, and doing them in cloud is just a little bit different. I also think we need to think more and more about how I'm going to use Kubernetes as an example. You can go build it yourself. You can go buy a third-party implementation of it, in an OpenShift or a Tanzu or some other approach to doing that. You still have to have some sort of way to be able to back up and recover those things. A platform gives you value. If I go out and buy a platform like an OpenShift, that's great, but I need that platform any place that I have the flexibility, any place that I want to move. And certainly Red Hat's gone to great lengths to try to give you that capability. VMware is doing the same thing with Tanzu. And all of the public cloud providers, back to Amazon Outposts and things like that, are trying to do the same thing to give you the capability of moving things around. I mentioned earlier the importance of avoiding the lock-in or avoiding individual vendor silos. I think we're all well aware that you're always making some choices around lock-in. I think the strongest guidance that we can give our clients, and this is a place that we often find ourselves helping advise them, is choose your platform carefully. Choose the place in the stack where you're making choices that are hard to get out of, or that may put you in a particular situation with real care. There's always a positive and a negative to any platform choice, and you can avoid them completely if you are willing to spend the people resources and the time and the skill to be able to build many of these things yourself, which is great. It's a unique place in technology that we've not been really until the last decade or so. So all of these data protection concepts, they're built off of architecture. They're built off of understanding the workflow that's underneath. They're built off of the new cloud capabilities that are out there, either through public cloud providers or through automation or through private cloud capabilities, cloud-like behavior, as we like to call it, that allow us to deliver the same value back to our organizations that we always have. Um, Ted, I think that's pretty much the topics we had for today. Anything that you wanted to add before we move on?
I do actually. One last thing. When we talk about all of these choices that we're making, I would say be mindful. I would tell our customers and our listeners, be mindful of the idea that the choices you make, the decisions you make, the architecture you look to add or change should increase your capabilities, make it possible for IT to help the business in new and innovative ways that not only are you attempting to avoid vendor lock-in, you're also attempting to avoid services or function lock-ins. Make your decisions based in part on whether or not you find that that enables you further down the course of decisions that you want your business to go. And if I may sound salesy for just a moment, I would ask you to choose your partners the same way. That when you're making those decisions, look for decisions that increase your capabilities.
I think that's a great point, and I this is what Ted and I love about our jobs is being able to have these conversations with our clients. I would welcome anyone listening to reach out to Ted or I or to the Evolving Solutions main mailbox info@evolvingsol.com, and we would be more than happy to engage in a conversation around data protection, around connectivity to public cloud, around cloud adoption, and really how all these things become possible going forward. So I'd like to say thank you to everybody for joining today. Thank you, Ted.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
I appreciate you taking out the time today, and looking forward to future conversations with anyone on the phone who would enjoy that. So thank you all, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. We hope you gained valuable insights on data protection. If you have any questions, as Michael said, or would like a follow-up after today's webinar, please reach out to your account rep or info@evolvingsol.com.